I'm no stranger to game development. After all, I've been modding for over 5 years now and have a well-documented list of projects I've not only worked on, but also finished and launched spanning numerous games. But modding is mostly just a hobby, and I knew that if I wanted to take this seriously, I'd need to start building a more official portfolio with finished games that I can show off. Now, while I currently am working on my own game, which is going to take quite some time to finish, I figured I would take the advice many developers and friends have given me in the past, which is enter a game jam, or many of them to be specific. So I eventually found a game jam starting in just 2 days with a 10-day submission period to work on the game, and it's called the 2 Buttons Jam. Now, I'd never heard of this before, but it's an unranked game jam which relies on one rule only. It must be played with only 2 control inputs. It's as though you're playing the game on an NES controller, right? You can either go left or right, or up and down. You have to have only 2 inputs to make your game function. I entered the jam, took the leap, and began thinking about what I would do for this event. I eventually came up with a rough concept of a 2D mining game. It didn't matter if I was mining for gems or if I was mining to reach the bottom of the world. All I knew is that I wanted to make a 2D mining game, and with that I was ready to see what the game jam had in store on the day of. So day 1 finally hit, and the topics for the game jam that we would be using as our guidance for the theme was Golem, Electric, and Stride. And instantly I started panicking because I didn't know what I was going to do that would relate to this at all, but that's fine, we would figure it out later on. However, it was important to note that this was not a mandatory thing, it was more of a guideline. You didn't have to do any of these themes, it was just something to help you get ideas. So nonetheless, I hopped into Unity and I started a new 2D project and began working on, first of all, the player, and I made a little platform that I could move along. So for the player, I was obviously using a rigid body 2D, and for the platform, these were just a collection of cubes which I prefabbed, and they also had colliders on, and then pretty simple, we just move along. I say pretty simple, this genuinely took way too long, like longer than it should have. I knew that if it was a mining game and if we only had 2 buttons that I would have to give the player something to mine with, so I attached 2 pickaxes, and this became a problem with the movement because the pickaxes often would make me tumble over, which that wasn't planned at all. I didn't think this was a huge deal though, and I intended on fixing it later, so in the meantime, I did what probably everybody watching this is going to say that I shouldn't do, which is perfectly fine because this is a learning experience. I hopped into Sprite to make some player sprites, because while it is easy to just get the concept first and do the art later, I would also make the argument that being able to visualize what you're working on helps you get the idea coming to fruition faster. So that's what I did. I hopped into Sprite and I drew up not only the pickaxe sprites as you can see, but also a little excavating drone for the player, which to be honest ended up looking more like a robot, which was not planned, but this ended up being what I went with for a little while. Now, when I first started this project, the plan was for the world to be randomly generated with chunks, and this was how I was going to go about making most of the game. However, on the day of the jam, it very quickly hit me that I have no idea how to do chunk generation, and even when I tried, it just was not coming out right. So I instead opted for a method which I'm sure is not going to be recommended by most people. I made everything by hand, and I didn't use the tilemap editor. In fact, these were just game objects which I was using the grid to put together. I know this is probably a really bad idea, but again, I want to reiterate that as we go through this, it's fine to do bad ideas because that's what game jams are for practicing, getting better, and showing how you grow over time. Let's just hope I grow over time. So next I worked on the mining mechanic. The way this works is pretty simple. Every cube that's in the world has a tag like can break, and it's also looking for a layer that can break it. In my case, it's the pickaxe. And the pickaxes, of course, use that tag, and when we press one of our input buttons, we strike with either side, and if it touches a cube, the cube says, oh, this is a pickaxe touching me, and then it breaks. And I mean, it kinda worked. Like, yeah, you could mine stuff, but it seemed like you were doing more damage to yourself than the environment, so that wasn't great. But I very quickly knew what I needed to do in order to feel better about this. I needed to hop back into Sprite and make more sprites for the game. Now, again, I'm not a pixel artist by any means, but I'll be honest, I actually think this stuff came out pretty well. Now, I know a lot of you are probably screaming, please use the tilemap editor, and don't worry, I am going to do that soon, but for the actual prefab game objects, this is what I went with for the whole game. Now, if these prefabs had rigid bodies on them and the plan was for them to bounce around and move, this game would probably explode my PC in seconds because doing all of that calculation is really bad on the system. But luckily, nothing in this game is going to have any of that, so we can just keep these stationary, we don't have to add rigid bodies, and we're totally fine, to be honest. I also added more block types like bedrock, which could not be mined, and I would use this to keep the player in the playable bounce, and I also added stone, which would take more hits to break. Although later on, I would go back and remove this in some places to make the mining feel more varied and less like an artificial padding as you go along. And because I'm using a selection of prefabs, I can make the world feel somewhat more natural in the generation by selecting random ones and replacing them with the one I want. And this way I can have little specks of stone or gems around the world to make it just feel a little more natural, and I really liked how it turned out. Now, so far I haven't been over how the controls for this game actually worked, which is a perfect segue into me working on putting the controls on screen so that players would know what they're doing when they jump in. In order to mine left in this game, all you have to do is press A or the left arrow key, and to mine right, you do the opposite with D. And you can also hold A and D or left and right at the same time to teleport back to the spawn point in case you fall down somewhere and need to get back up. But not only this, you can move left or move right by holding. This is cool because it's a multifunctional input, and I really like that, and I was happy with this right away. Additionally, you can jump by holding any directional input and tapping the opposite one. So if you want to jump to the right, you just move to the right and tap the left input and you'll jump. I also went ahead and added a temporary placeholder UI on the screen for the materials we would collect, which in this game is going to be dirt, stone, and gems. Finally, I ended off day one by hopping back into Sprite and making some quick little designs for rubies, emeralds, and sapphires, and then I would go into the world and place those down. Now with dirt, stone, and gems as a functional mineable thing in the world, I could update the UI whenever you go and mine one of these, so now it tracks how much you've done. And I also went and added a depth meter as well, so you can see how deep in the world you've gone. It's not necessary, but I thought it would be a nice touch, so I decided to keep it in, and with that, that was the end of day one, and I'm pretty happy with my progress. Now, going into day two, it wasn't long before I realized that the current mining mechanic just was not going to work. The reason why is because it was working on a collision system, and this was a problem because it meant that if the pickaxe swung through multiple things at once, even if unintentional, you would end up mining 3 or 4 blocks, and that wasn't great and didn't feel good or impactful. So what I ended up doing was going back in and replacing this with a raycast system. Basically, the way this works is that on the left and the right of the player, we are drawing out 2 raycasts, and they are checking if they are touching something which can be broken. If they are, when we press mine left or mine right, it's going to check what it's hitting. If we can mine it, it's going to increase the amount of hits it's taken. And once we hit the break threshold, we then break the block and update our stat, which is then reflected on the UI. Now, this is all well and good, but we would of course need a way to mine it down. So to fix this, what I did was I drew 2 extra raycasts from the feet of the player or the bottom of the model. And now we have a logic that checks if we are raycasting to the left or the right of the player and we mine left or right. If we don't hit anything, we're instead going to check the bottom raycasts, and if there's a block beneath us that's being hit, then we will mine that instead. And that way you can have somewhat deliberate gameplay if you want to mine down or mine to the left or the right. All you need is some little movement adjustments to get the game to recognize what you're looking at. And when you test it and play it, it becomes pretty clear very fast that that's how that works. Although I am curious how you would go about this, so if you think you have a better way of solving this issue, let me know. But overall, I was happy with this and it felt somewhat smooth. I then spent a little extra time working on detailing the world to make it feel less plain. So I added some uneven ground. I also went into Sprite and dropped some extra grass and flowers flowers and even some little rocky spires for the caves, and this just made the world feel a little more alive. I also decided that I would finally implement the Unity tile map. I found this really great tile map by Mithril Age on itch.io, so I decided it would be perfect for the game and picked it up, leaving a donation for the artist and then making some adjustments to it in Photoshop so it matches more of the color palette of the game. Now I'm not gonna lie, I had a really massive headache working with this. I've worked with Unity's tile map system before and got on with it relatively fine, but for some reason I was having many issues here, and it took a couple of hours to get this in and have it be something I was actually happy with, and the new visuals made the game look so much more polished and I was really happy with it. Now finally, to end off day 2, I needed a way to give some kind of risk to the game, and I decided the perfect way to do this was to add a durability system. Instead of giving the player a health bar, I figured that the pickaxe should just be their health bar, and if they break the pickaxe by not repairing it during gameplay, then it's game over. The difficulty loop of the game becomes making sure that you're always keeping an eye on your durability and then going up to the surface to repair your pickaxe. I just made sure that the player had a public integer which was called pickaxe health, and every time a block is broken we pass to pickaxe health that we need to minus or subtract however much durability. And day 3 would be where I add the anvil mechanic, which is where you would repair your pickaxe. But first, there was some stuff that I would have to get around to doing. The first one was improving the player camera, which currently was not good at all. But luckily there's a really easy way to make a decent 2D player camera, and Unity just kind of hands it you on a plate. It's called the Cinemachine camera, and it's as simple as dragging it in and putting it on the player, and now we've got more of a cinematic camera that looks really smooth, and it didn't require a single line of code on my end, which is always a plus, right? I also knew that the game would need some kind of title screen. I wasn't going to commit to options or anything like that, but I did want a simple toggle to turn on or off the sound and to start the game, and I figured I could weave this into being a seamless part of the world. So the way I did the game title was by just putting a canvas overlay on the player and locking their movement when you start the game, and you can either mine left to turn off or on the sound, or mine right to start the game, and then the title disappears and you get right into the action. And to be honest, this didn't take too long. It may have only taken me around 45 minutes to an hour to get done, and it needed some adjustments for sure, but overall I was pretty happy with it. Before I got around to working on the anvil, I first needed to get around to making the game look a little better. So this is where I looked into the idea of a dithering or posterization effect to make the game look more classic. After all, the 2 buttons jam does advertise it being playable on an NES controller, so what better way to make the game stand out visually than making it look like an NES game to a degree. Now, unfortunately, this is where I found out the hard way that I absolutely cannot stand the Unity shader graph. Now, of course, what I mean by that is I suck at using the Unity shader graph, but that is okay because the Unity Asset Store does have some pre-made shaders which you can get and put into your game, and luckily I found one called Darkbringer which looks really good. It took some tweaking, but overall I thought after this it was a big visual change to the game, but one that overall made it stand out massively and improved the visuals of the game overall. Now by this point I was on an absolute roll and I knew exactly what needed to be done. Day 3 was shaping up to be my most productive day yet, and I did not want to slow down even though the time was getting on. So I decided I would indeed finish that anvil mechanic, or at least get started on it. So I hopped into Ace Sprite, drew up a quick anvil sprite which I think is decent, and then went back into the engine to finalize how this was going to work. The idea for this mechanic is pretty simple. You press either A or D to do one of 2 things. One of them is repair your pickaxe, which will restore all of your durability, and this is going to cost you stone and dirt. And the second mechanic would be to upgrade the pickaxe, and this would cost you gems. And upgrading the pickaxe would make it so that every time you mine a block, another block nearby gets broken as well. So the more you upgrade it, the more blocks you break, and the faster you progress. I would also make it so that upgrading the pickaxe would give you higher durability thresholds, so that with the extra added blocks being broken every hit, you weren't just melting through your durability in record time. I also came up with another mechanic for the game, which would be a locked chamber that you would have to retrieve an item from. But the only issue is that this chamber would be blocked by an electrical barrier, and in order to break it you'd have to find the corresponding color switch nearby and mine it, which would then open up the chamber so you can go inside. Honestly, this didn't really require much coding at all, because all I simply did was link the chamber door to the switch, so when you mine the switch it also gets rid of the door, because the door is a child of the parent, which is the switch. Okay, it was getting really late and there were two final things that I wanted to do. First of all was to make the items that you would collect, and I decided that they would be these little golden goblets with a mining icon on it. I also wanted to fix a really annoying bug I had been having, where when you move along the floor you would just randomly get stuck, and I did this by changing the box collider on the player to a circle collider, and this did result in having these little jittery bounces as you move along the ground, but honestly I took it as more of a plus because it made the player look more animated without me having to do any actual animation for the player. Now, speaking of the player, it was long overdue for a change of sprite, so I went back into Ace Sprite and made a little golem design. After all, the theme of this game jam is golem, or at least one of them. So I went back in and made a cute little dude, and I wasn't really going with any real design choice here other than he had to look adorable. So he's just made of 2 boulders and he's always got his hands up in the air celebrating being alive, I guess. I made a run and a jump animation for him, and that was all I was going to do on the player for the rest of the night. And finally I went back to the goblets and made a little system where you could place them down to open a door at the bottom of the map. So your end goal in the game is basically to obtain all of the goblets, get down to the bottom of the world, place them all into each of the key doors, and then you get to the end of the game. Okay, so moving on to day 4. Today I wanted to make the world feel even more alive than it had before by adding music zones. This way I can have music playing when you're in the overworld, and then change the music when you get into the caves, and so on and so forth. The way I did this was very simple. I just make a trigger zone that detects if the player is inside it. If it is, it plays looping music. If they then go into another zone, we stop that music and start the next track. I also wanted the player to feel more interactive with the player, if that makes sense. So I added a little dialogue system where text can be displayed at the bottom of the screen at any moment, given whether or not the player is near an objective or if they're falling really fast. And this way, when you're playing the game, you get a little insight into what the character is thinking when they're doing certain things. For example, if your pickaxe is about to break, they'll say that they need to go and repair it, and that kind of gives the player a hint that if they don't do that, something might happen. I also wanted there to be other ways that you could cause destruction underground, so I made a sprite for TNT, and I decided I would place these randomly underground, and then when the player stumbles across them, all they have to do is smack them and they will explode, creating a ton of free materials. And this was relatively easy to make. It's basically just a circle collider 2D around the TNT, and when we melee it, we just make sure to check what blocks we caught inside of that circle and break them. Lastly, to end off day 4, I wanted to go ahead and get the art for the game out of the way, so I went into Photoshop, took some of the sprites from the game and a screenshot, and I made the cover image and the banner for the itch.io page, because this would increase the amount of clicks hopefully my game would get by having some cute art that makes it stand out. I also decided I would land on the name Dual Wield Digging. It just felt kind of charming to me and very descriptive of what the gameplay was. Over the next couple of days I put my focus into playtesting, because it's one of the most important parts of anything you do. If you're cooking, the chef has to taste his food, and when you're cooking on a game, you have to taste your game, right? So I made sure that I was testing every single time I made a change to make sure it felt right, and also I put a ton of time into overall polish, making sure that there wasn't any anomalies that felt weird and kind of took away from the whole experience. And after finishing the ending and being content with what I had there, I went and set up the itch.io page for the game. I feel like this might be a pretty overlooked part of the process, but for me it was the most important one. The game needs to sell off of the look alone, and it's not a paid game, but what I mean by that is that when you scroll in the feed and you see all of the submissions from this game jam, I wanted to make sure that people saw this game and it stuck out and they clicked it, and when they got to the page wasn't boring, it leapt out at them and made them want to play. All I did for the majority of this is take some sprites websites and also screenshots of the game and then used them to just make an immersive feeling landing page. And so, with around a day and a half left in the jam, I submitted my game and you can play it now. It's linked in the description. This was my first game jam, and one of the biggest things I learned from it is that I really like this. Knowing that you're making something for a guaranteed audience is so fulfilling, and knowing that, you know, you could be making an indie game for a week or a month or a year just to put it on Steam and have no one play it, it's a different feeling, right? When you enter a game jam, you know people are going to play your game, and it just makes it worth it. I also learned a lot more about the Unity engine, like overall skills with 2D and what not to do in scripts, and I also learned very, very quickly that burnout sucks, although I kind of already knew that. But here it is, my mining game that I made in just over a week for the 2 Buttons Jam 2025, and I gotta say, I think I'll be doing more game jams after this, so if you have any suggestions, let me know in the comment section down below, and if you're here and you enjoyed this video, you might like the content on my main channel, so feel free to go over there and drop a sub too. Thanks guys, and I'll check you in the next one.